October 18th, 2022 meeting of the City Finance Committee, and may I have a roll call, please?
Yes, Committee Member Harmon.
Here.
Committee Member Rouse.
Here.
Committee Chair Friedman.
Here. Before we get on to the item, we do have public comment for items not on today's agenda. But before we get into that, I just need to make an announcement that we are having technical difficulties with the remote public comment, so that is not available at this time if you're watching from home. And we apologize, and we're trying to fix it, but it is not able to be fixed at this time. And so with that, is there any member of the public who wishes to speak to items not on the agenda that is in the room today? Not seeing. I'll close public comment. And now we'll turn it over for our item today, which is as part of the Fiscal Sustainability Initiative. We are reviewing different departments, and one that we thought would be very informative, since we do partner with them a lot, is the Housing Authority. And today we have Mr. Rob Fredericks, the Executive Director, who will be making the presentation. And I look forward to you being here today in the presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Friedman and committee members. Rob Fredericks, Executive Director of the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara. We have a lot of slides to go through today, but I'm going to try and make it as efficient as possible for all of you. But before I begin, I want to introduce my team members that are here, Mr. Szymanski, Mr. Azam, Ms. Montenegro, and Mr. Pearson. And we also have our three commissioners here, Chair Lucille Boss, Commissioner Wheatley, and Commissioner Rao. So moving right along, we have our mission and vision statement here, and the reason I bring up our mission, which is to create safe, affordable, quality housing opportunities for family and individuals while promoting self-sufficiency and neighborhood revitalization, that's what we're all about. And we're a mission-driven organization to achieve results in the housing sector that's needed in Santa Barbara. And through our mission, we serve a variety of households, including low-income working families with children, seniors on fixed incomes, disabled, those who are homeless, and victims of domestic violence, as well as moderate and middle income households. Our history, we were created through Measure C back in 1968, where the City Council found a need for a local housing authority rather than just the county housing authority. And that measure passed, and in October of 1969, we were officially formed. And again, we were created by the city for the purpose of providing low-income housing. We are a legally distinct public entity separate from city government, and we receive no local tax revenue or general funds. I want to go over legally mandated and discretionary functions of the Housing Authority. So per state law, the Housing Authority is only required to rent up to 20% of our income, of our inventory for low-income households, believe it or not. Legally, we could rent 80% of our housing inventory at market rate. However, we're dedicated to providing affordable housing, and if we didn't do that, I think I would be run out of town, as well as all my colleagues. And that's why we choose to keep 100% of our inventory at affordable levels, and we will continue to remain 100% affordable across all of our current and future properties. So our discretionary functions are broken down into 4 different sections. Discretionary, provide affordable rental housing for moderate to middle income households, provide supportive services, acquire and develop additional affordable housing, and offer support and expertise to local nonprofits with repairs, renovations, or other development of affordable housing. And although we're not mandated to do these functions, we're committed to them. And in providing for moderate to middle income housing, we're serving a demographic that's historically left without resources in housing. These are households who earn too much for our federal and state subsidized housing, yet earn too little to afford market rate units. And we also recognize the importance of supportive services in addressing the needs of our residents and ensuring self-sufficiency. And many housing authorities do not build or acquire affordable housing. They simply administer the federal Housing Choice Voucher Program, otherwise known as Section 8. But we early on chose differently, that we are going to be an active developer of affordable housing, and that's what we do. On helping nonprofits, we recently assisted El Zoco Condominiums for a major reconstruction project. We also recently acquired Santa Barbara Green Mobile Home Park to prevent foreclosure on the property and save one of the last available options of low income home ownership on the property. So now I want to go over staffing of the Housing Authority. This is our organization chart here on the screen. It's a little hard to read, I apologize. The Housing Authority is a small but efficient and effective agency consisting of 5 departments: Administration and Human Services, Housing Management, Resident Services, Property and Development, and Finance. We currently have 61 regular or provisional employees, and I don't know if this is important to you or not, but 52% of our staff are female, 48% are male, 100% of our supervisor positions are held by females, and we break down 43% are Hispanic. And we're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our agency. Next slide. Here's a graphical representation of the split of our staffing. And most of the housing authority's work is highly technical and requires a firm understanding of various local, state, and federal program regulations, rules, and policies. Additionally, our staff need to have the knowledge and judgment capabilities to address fair housing, reasonable accommodations, construction, building and safety, maintenance, social services, supportive services, community collaborations, financial best practices, technical support, and so much more. We have been able to achieve many accomplishments despite having a relatively small staff due to a focus on training, efficiency, and accountability. So now let's go over programs and services. Our housing programs are broken into 4 separate categories. First, as I mentioned early on, the major program is our Housing Choice Voucher Program, otherwise known as Section 8. These are rental assistance to the private landlord community in Santa Barbara for our residents. Second is our local affordable housing program. These are non-federal or state programs. These are properties acquired by the Housing Authority or built with our own local funds or conventional financing. Third is the local housing tax credit program. And finally, the rental assistance demonstration program, which is formerly public housing. Let's go to the next slide and I'll show you how that's broken down on a graph here. So the majority of the units are through the Housing Choice Voucher Program, partnering with the private landlord community of 2,891 units. It's by far our largest program, followed by the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is currently the main funding source for creating additional low-income housing. Next is what we call our RAD, or formerly public housing, most of which was built in the early 70s and 80s. Lastly is our local housing program that I described to you early on, but through that program, on many of the units, we're able to serve moderate and middle income households. Next slide. And then let's take a look at our hard units that we own and operate compared to the overall housing units in Santa Barbara. So Santa Barbara has 41,215 total housing units, of which 24,103, or approximately 58%, are renter occupied. And then our units are 1,451. So our units represent 3.5% of the overall city housing stock, or 6% of the rental housing stock. And I wanted to make that clear because often we hear people conflate the numbers that we have at 20 or 25%, and that's just not the case. We need so much more. Next slide. This is a graphical representation of our units spread throughout the city, and we're proud that we've been able to acquire and develop properties that aren't just located in one section of the city to where, oh, well, that's the low-income housing section. No, it's dispersed throughout the entire city. Next slide. Next in services is our supportive services, and that consists of family self-sufficiency, supportive services program, youth services, senior services, and our Family Resource Center. And these are broader categories where we have, when we go to the next slide, which we can go to now, really detail the manner of different services that we provide. And I won't read each one out to you, but just a wide variety of services to really tailor to what our residents are needing, whether they're families, seniors, homeless, or disabled. That's where we like to say we're more than just housing. We're more than just the sticks and bricks that we build and own. We want to make our residents have a nice place to call home and be successful in their lives. Next slide. We can't do all of these services alone. Our wheelhouse is providing housing, but we know that so much more is needed. So if you go to the next slide, we collaborate with many, many different nonprofits throughout the city that help provide those services on the previous slide that I mentioned. And that is because our first and primary role is affordable housing. We don't specialize in what's needed as far as services. We're housers, but we know that to ensure successful tenancies, support residents with self-sufficiency, exterior support is needed. And we're grateful for these long-term partnerships that we've had. So let's look at alternative levels of services, and this will probably differ from other departments you've heard from. Next slide. We're looking at really increasing the number of housing units that are needed and meeting the residents' needs for supportive housing. So we're proud of what we've done. We don't believe this is the time to consider any reductions in services or waiver in our commitment to provide additional affordable housing. Our services ensure that residents can achieve self-sufficiency, stability, and whatnot. So we're seeking to increase our levels of services and available housing in response to the local housing crisis. Next slide, please. Let's look at barriers to serving eligible households. So there are three main barriers. That is the lack of sufficient housing. We all know that there's just not enough sufficient housing for everyone in this city, living or working in the city. There's a lack of financial resources to create additional affordable housing, which you've heard from us before on. And there's a lack of available land or other properties for the creation of appropriate and suitable affordable housing. Now we get to the budget and financing section, and I'd like to invite our finance director, Mr. Pearson, up to cover this section, and then I'll come back up to cover the remainder of the slides. Hopefully we'll have enough for time for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon, Chair Friedman, committee members. My name is Bob Pearson. I'm the Finance Director of the Housing Authority. And next, there we go. So this is kind of a 30,000-foot look at our finances, and we'd obviously be glad to provide you with any more detail you want. Essentially, this is our current year adopted budget. We're on a March 31st fiscal year end. So what you're looking at when you hear is basically the three components of our operations. The two on the left-hand side, the local non-HUD, which is essentially our general fund, and then the Santa Barbara Affordable Housing Group, which is an affiliated 501c3, shares a common governing board, which is the commission that you appoint. And then on the right, the federal programs. And the 3 points I want to make on this slide is, if you look at the size of the budget, you'll see that the federal programs dominate the dollars. It's about 78 or 70 or 72 or 73% rather of the total budget is the federal programs. And when you take out the federal programs, we're essentially a $17 million operation, which is quite small actually. And even out of the federal programs, if you see the number up there for the government grants, HAP, that is the housing assistance payments, the Section 8 voucher money, $40,978,600. That's strictly a pass-through that comes into the Housing Authority from HUD, and we pass it through to the local landlords. So even though it's $62.5 million in total, really the local programs is fairly small at only about $17 million. On the expense side, again, the same three columns, but you can see the operating expenses. And you see there at the bottom of the operating expenses, housing voucher payments, that's the same number, the Section 8 vouchers. And then we have about $1.8 million of debt service principal and interest. So total expenses, about $60.5 million, of which $45 million is federal. And lastly, the bottom line, the punchline, if you will, next slide please, is what that results in is for our local non-HUD general fund, the net income is actually a net loss of $437,000 and change. That is offset by the fact that we receive loan payments, residual receipt loan payments based on the results of operations of some of our tax credit properties. And that is budgeted at $2 million a year. So when you add that back in, we do project to add to our reserves this year of about $1.4 million. The Santa Barbara Affordable Housing Group, which owns all of what used to be the public housing units, shows a net income of about $2.1 million, and the federal programs net addition to reserves of $353,000, which is essentially leftover HUD administrative funding that we don't spend all of it. So I think the point really is that it's a small organization, and for an organization that the bulk of the local revenue is rental income from low-income tenants who are essentially paying 30% of their income to rent, the fact that we can break even is, even after 12 years in this job, is something of a surprise to me, but it works. But the margins are thin, and what it doesn't include, of course, and Rob will get back into this, is the capital maintenance that's required to maintain the properties. While we budget for routine maintenance year in, year out, the capital maintenance, you just never know. It's expensive. You lose a roof, it's $500,000, or a boiler system. So it's thin. And what I want to show you is now, so this is our net position, or our equity, and our reserves. And so you can see, again, we're looking here at just the two local programs, the Housing Authority and the Santa Barbara Affordable Housing Group. So we start with our invested in capital net, which is obviously not spendable money, because that's what our investment in fixed assets is. And then we have restricted reserves. We have some money from HUD dollars, the disposition of the public housing units into Santa Barbara Affordable Housing Group. Those funds are now accounted for in the Housing Authority, about $6.8 million. We can use those under the terms of the agreement with HUD, but it's restricted. So it can't be used necessarily for all lawful purposes that fall within our scope of service. The biggest one is we have long-term notes receivable of $153.5 million. So we can't spend those, obviously, because we haven't collected it yet. They're essentially loans that people owe us. And then we come down to designated, which are not legally restricted, but are designated by policy adopted by the commission. We have about $5.5 million in replacement reserves. And then unrestricted, undesignated, we have a total of about $14 million split between the Housing Authority and the Santa Barbara Affordable Housing Group. Obviously, as you well know, it's important that we retain some operating cushion because we don't have a lot of surplus each year, year in and year out. But this is also the only fund that we have to put towards future development or to unforeseen capital needs. So that's essentially the quick overview of our finances.
Thank you, Bob. All right, next is a quick slide of our pipeline projects that we've allocated pre-development funds and that I wanted to ensure that you were all aware of and thought there'd be some interest. We have our 200 North La Cumbra that will be 48 units for low-income families, a tax credit development. Then we have 400 West Carrillo, which you're all familiar with, the Carrillo Castillo commuter lot that we've allocated the pre-development funds through the Housing Authority. Grace Village 2 will be we just started the planning for that. It's a smaller piece of property behind the Grace Village development that we will be able to provide more senior units. And then Monterey and Presidio Springs are both former public housing units, part of that RAD inventory that we talked about. And those are both properties that were built in the early 70s that were fairly low dense. And we're looking inwardly at what can we do on our own properties to increase the number of affordable housing units. So for Monterey, for instance, that was built at 13.15 units per acre. With a development plan we have now, we're looking at 27 units to the acre and providing much more housing there. Presidio Springs, same thing. It was built at 26 units per acre, and we're looking at 68 units per acre redevelopment there. And although these are both planned in the medium-high density, if they're Capital A affordable housing, there's no limit to the density that we can place on the properties. But these 27 and the 68 units, we feel fit within the area that really would complement the neighborhood and still provide the amount of affordable housing. That's something we're always cognizant of as we plan for new developments. We want to push as much as we can for as many units, but we also need it to fit in within Santa Barbara. So this probably should have been under finance, but I'll go over it. These are our leveraged assets. And there's been a question of, well, does the Housing Authority leverage its own assets to create affordable housing? And yes, we do. And we have, as you can see there, almost $37 million in long-term loans. And every year we have to plan for our debt service for these loans. And as you can see, it's about almost $1.6 million every year that we have to plan for the debt and the retirement of debt. So use of the city's CDBG funds, this is where we really have a strong partnership with the city. There's funds that are allowed to be used for larger capital improvement projects, roofing for one, and some other development type rehabilitation, and we utilize that quite extensively. Every time we access those funds, a new 90-year covenant is required, which we, we're okay with. We're in the housing business in perpetuity. We want these units to be available in perpetuity. Next slide. Next, there are city loans. And this is also where the city has been very supportive to the Housing Authority in partnerships with us. We request loans from the city for activities related to both property acquisition and new construction. And without assistance from the city, we would be less successful in these endeavors due to the lack of available funding to be competitive in the private market. Additionally, the most viable option for developing new housing units is the low-income housing tax credit program. It's a competitive process, and applications without local public loans are less competitive and less likely to receive an award for credits. And also, all these residual receipts loans that the city has given us, we're actively repaying on those loans. And all those, not only from us, but other affordable housing developers, any funds paid back through the old RDA loans must be re-spent on affordable housing. So unfunded or underfunded or unfunded priorities. Let's go over those. We have property acquisition, that we have opportunities that come up all the time. Sometimes we need to pass because we don't have the funding. New construction and development, moderate to middle income housing, supportive services and programs. Now let's talk about unfunded capital projects that Mr. Pearson was talking about earlier. We do have needed funds for new construction, 200 North La Cumbra that I mentioned earlier, and the Grace Village 2 senior housing, and the new construction rehabilitation of Monterey Village and Presidio Springs. We have many properties throughout our inventory that need new painting, complete re-roofing, fencing, parking, rehabilitation. The list goes on, including cable and internet upgrade throughout for our residents. Next slide. Let's talk about the historical cost of developing affordable housing. Here's a slide that covers many of our developments since 2006. You'll see here that the low-income housing tax credit equity raised 47% of the equity needed, and housing authority funding 24%, and other federal funds or permanent loans 22%. I do want to make a note of correction on city funds. There was an El Carrillo land loan for 1.775, so that brings the city's participation up to 7%. And while that seems low, it was instrumental in us being able to create these developments, showing the state that we have those local public funds really do help. Next. And here's just a breakdown of that earlier slide that I mentioned. And then the dissolution of the redevelopment agency in 2012 was really particularly harmful to housing authorities across the state and affordable housing developers. The housing authority's rate of creating new development affordable housing was reduced by almost 50% with the dissolution of the RDA and its available funds. So we've been having to scramble for other funding, but these before the dissolution, between 1999 and 2009, with the help of the RDA funds, 508 units were created throughout the city. I mentioned we repay our residual receipts to the city annually. Those are funds that the city previously gave us for acquisition or new construction through the RDA. And annually, we've been repaying about $658,000 back to the city for those loans they've given us, and last year it was 634,000. So I just wanted to ensure that there's a realization that we are an active, because of the success of those developments, we're able to repay those loans that can be recirculated back to not only us, but other affordable housing developments that come the city's way. Okay, you've seen this chart in previous presentations by us. The blue shaded part of the chart represents the current RHNA cycle, and you can see there that anticipated end of cycle, we're looking at achieving about a 44% success rate of achieving the regional housing needs allocation goals. On the gold part, that's the upcoming cycle, and if we use that same rate of housing production, we would produce even less percentage-wise, only 22%, and very small amounts of affordable, low-income, and moderate. So that's why you often hear us being interested in seeking and pursuing a dedicated, ongoing local source of funding for affordable housing, not only for us, but other developers of affordable housing in the community. So here are some keys to more affordable housing and leveraging funds. The average total development cost for 6 developments over the last 11 years has been $350,000 per unit. The total development cost over all developments is approximately $106 million, and on average, the city provided 10% of the development cost overall of those projects. And the city contributions averaged $34,000 per unit across those 6 developments that created 304 units. That's a pretty good investment by the city of $34,000 to create a unit and to create 304 units. And each dollar that the city invested that we used on looking at these 6 developments leveraged their funds 10.2 to 1. So that's why you've heard us saying we can leverage your funds 10 to 1. And let's give a couple of examples. First, we have Grace Village Apartments that was completed in 2018, 58 units. On this development, your city provided $1 million to this development, and that provided a 24 times leverage of the other capital stack required to create the funding. And that was a city investment of just over $17,000 per unit, given the size of the development. Let's look at Johnson Court, the next slide. This one is a 17-unit veteran housing for those moving from homelessness. This was a $2 million investment by the city, and that leveraged the 5 times leveraged of the total development cost. And that's an investment of $118,000 per unit, which is a lot, but those smaller developments require, you don't get the economies of scale that are needed on spreading the funding. So keys to acquisition, to leveraging more acquisitions. We've been an active purchaser of housing, taking housing from market rate to affordable and providing for moderate and middle income housing. The average purchase price for 7 acquisitions over the last 7 years, $284,000 per unit on average. Most properties were acquired with 77% debt financing. That's where I say we access other debt as well, not just the city's debt. And our housing authority contribution on our own funds was about $65,000 per unit. So under the assumption that any funding would offset our 50% of the housing authority's funding, every $32,500 of new money could reasonably acquire 1 or more residential units. So that's a leverage of 8.7 to 1 on average. So revenue generating and funding opportunities. As a public agency, the Housing Authority does not seek or pursue revenue profit generating options in a traditional sense. We do seek funding opportunities when available and applicable to our work. Any revenue generated is reinvested into improving operations, property maintenance, capital projects, property acquisition, or new construction activities. Many funding opportunities are project-specific, competitive, highly regulated, or inapplicable to the Housing Authority. And I wanted to go over a few of those funding opportunities that have been put out there that says you need to look at these. So in the housing element, there's a table, Table 38, the proposed housing element that's under review at the state currently. We looked at those Table 38 and those funding programs, and out of the 22 identified potential funding sources that were listed, 12 are not applicable to the developments that we provide. 5 are maybes with contingencies, and they're not applicable to all the developments we do. And 5 are applicable with contingencies not appropriate for all types of projects, but we could work with. So we are looking at those. Many of these that are maybes or yes, they have to come through the city or the county, not through the Housing Authority. So that's another stumbling block for us. And if we go to the next slide, these are the actual tables. I can't even read these, so I'm not going to go through them, but what I did want you to know is that there's too few competitive funding sources listed to leverage funding for affordable housing developments that would address the full spectrum of need in our community. Funding sources targeted from very low income, which is 50% of the area median income, to low income, 80% AMI, or moderate AMI. They're really absent from the list, and we can go through these slides. The ones that I highlighted on the table are the ones that could possibly work for us, and we will look at those with the new opportunities with the city that come our way. Okay, opportunities for streamlining. As your public housing operating arm, we are continually looking for ways to improve efficiency and meet our internal goals and objectives. One method that we utilize through this endeavor is the creation and revision of the Housing Authority's 5-year action plan. That plan that we create is influenced by community needs, our own wait lists, and the city's housing element. And it includes a review of our current operations, external opportunities, external constraints, our own internal strengths, and then we take all of that and we create and revise and update our goals and objectives. And there are 6 main goals that I wanted to show you out of our action plan. That's to create and preserve quality, affordable housing opportunities for the community, maintain the agency's strong financial position and ability to respond to economic conditions, economic stability and upward mobility through community engagement and partnerships. 4, foster a culture of excellence and innovation in our work environment. 5, promote sustainable practices. And finally, goal 6 is to continue to strengthen our relationship with the city to further our agency's role as the city's affordable housing operating arm. So, in closing, I just want to say that we appreciate the hard work that our partners at the city does every day, day in and day out. The council, all of the planning commission, all of the other design review boards that we work closely with. And we certainly want to continue to do the work that's needed for the city. And when we're advocating for funding, it's coming from a place of not for us, it's coming from a place of what can we do to really scale up and meet the needs of the community. So with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Fredericks. Appreciate the presentation and your staff being here and all your board members and others. It's important that we understand what you're doing because as part of the Fiscal Sustainability Initiative, we do have that financing partnership with you. So it is, and the housing aspect of it. So it's important that we understand as we look to be our Vision 2030, so we can continue that partnership. So with that, I will open up to questions. I'll go to my colleague, Committee Member Harmon. You have the floor.
Thank you. I get to go before Randy. This is exciting. It's always a good day. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to save most of my thanks for comments, but I have to just start by saying how immensely grateful I am for all the work that you all do. Truly, I mean, I've learned so much from all of you, and then just to see you work is really thrilling. It's one of my favorite parts about being involved in the city is to be able to be part of this partnership. So very much appreciate that, and I will expand on it briefly in comments. But I have just a couple of questions. Try to be quick. So the first, I really struggle with how we use the word leverage when we're talking about leveraging and leveraging dollars, because to me, the word, I mean, it has a number of different meanings, right? And I think even throughout this presentation, for me, it's leveraged, we mean it in a certain way on one side and maybe in a different way on another side. And I just was wondering if you could talk me through, and the reason I'm asking this is because I get asked this question a lot and I'm not particularly well versed in this. When we say that by investing city dollars, we can leverage that to access additional funding streams. So is that primarily through tax credit finance? Can you sort of talk me through how that works? And yeah, I guess that's the question.
Sure. So, and if I don't answer the question correctly, I know Mr. Szymanski and Mr. Azam can help me out, but it is primarily through the low-income housing tax credit program. That is the main funding source, as I mentioned, for any affordable housing program of any size. And in order to be able to competitively access that program through the state, we need to show support of other public funding sources from the local community. Otherwise, our application will not score as well as other applications throughout the state. Our area of competition for geographic competition for low-income housing tax credits span from Ventura all the way up to Santa Cruz on the what's called the coastal housing section. So there are a lot of developers every application round looking for those credits, and our developments have to be really bulletproof on the funding and the amount of public funding. So that is where we really say where we can leverage with the tax credit program. But having said that, when we put the other capital stack together that's needed to close the funding gap for total development cost, the other funders, even our conventional lenders, they'll look at, okay, what else is in the development to make this development work? And the city funding, as a residual receipts loan, our lenders are happy with that because they know that it's not must-pay debt at the time. They get first dibs at the funds that are must-pay debt. So I don't know if I'm confusing it more, but I just wanted to say, yes, it's leveraged. The main leverage is with the low-income housing tax credit program, but we are also saying, let's look at the entire capital stack because we may not have been able to receive that other loan from whatever source if we didn't have that residual receipt funding from the city.
That's very helpful. I really appreciate that, and I will be replaying that segment so that I can say it to other people.
Right. So Mr. Szymanski is reminding me, it also speaks to acquisition opportunities. We have one right now, we're going to close on small development, eight units, 2 separate buildings on Kentia. And the city is giving us a residual receipts loan to make that purchase happen. Otherwise, we probably would have passed on that without those funds that are available. And again, those funds are through the city's loan repayment funds, and there's also the inclusionary fund, but I believe the funds that are being used for that purchase is that loan repayment funds that we pay into every year, but other affordable housing developments repay into.
Okay, thank you. That brings up another question. On the residual receipts loans that you guys use for acquisition, for example, there's no covenant that is associated with those loans, or is there a covenant?
There are a covenant, and it's a 90-year
Okay,
covenant.
so that brings up a question, and I'm not advocating for anything. I'm just asking the question. Does it impact your ability to get other effective types of financing by requiring that 90-year covenant? Like, would it be better for you guys in terms of what you can leverage with other maybe conventional lenders if we require a shorter covenant, for example? Or is that not relevant for the type of housing you're doing?
I don't think it's really relevant for
Okay.
the housing authority.
So they know what they're getting into?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then another question. So one thing that we touched on maybe only briefly in looking at the budget is, in your organization, I know you guys run a really, really tight ship, but in terms of overhead, and I can't even imagine how you do all that you do, but I know you all have to and deserve to be paid. Where does that money come out of in terms of the loans and the funding? So say the city gives $32,000 per unit, how much of that $32,000 will go toward administrative costs, if any? And if it doesn't come out of that, how do you get paid?
Bob, do you want to answer that? But a very minimal amount comes out of that. We have our non-HUD general fund that take care of our administrative costs. So.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Good afternoon again, Committee Member Harmon. No, I mean, when the city lends us money for acquisition or development, then every dollar of that goes into the ground. How we pay for our administrative overhead is really twofold. One is a fairly large portion of our staff are funded by the Section 8 HCV program. HUD gives us about $3 million a year to strictly for administrative costs to run the program, separate from the actual housing choice voucher payment money. So we get 2 chunks. We get the actual pass-through for the rent payments, and we get a separate grant for administration, which, as I said, is about $3 million a year. And a fairly large portion, as I said, of our staff is paid from those funds. The staff that are not paid from Section 8 are generally paid from our local general fund, which is funded, as you saw, mostly by tenant rents. You know, there are some housing choice vouchers on our own units, and so we do get market rent essentially for those units. It's not a huge percentage of them, but that's how all the administrative costs are paid, either from the Section 8 program or from our local general fund, from tenant rents and other small grants we might get.
Thank you. That's an extremely, extremely important point in my mind to really hit home, because a lot of people, when we talk about funding streams, when we talk about grants, anything, you know, what they hear is 20% off the top, you know, and the fact that this is going directly to building housing, acquiring housing, I think is really special to your organizations. I really, really appreciate that. And just a couple more, thank you, Chair, if you'll indulge me. This next one, I guess, is for Mr. DeMartini. Do you have a number, and I apologize I didn't ask this in advance, but do you have a number available of how much per year the city, or let's just say this year, has either given in the form of loans or grants to to the Housing Authority? And if not, it's my fault for not asking in
No
advance.
problem, Committee Member Harmon. I do not have that number readily available. I'll work with community development staff to get a number for you and distribute that to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, that would be helpful. And then, let's see, two more quick ones. On the dedicated funding stream, Mr. Fredericks, are you envisioning, and I know we're not talking about that today, it's a larger question, but I can't help myself. Would you envision that that would go toward acquisition and development only, or also un or underfunded capital projects? Because I mean, it's interesting to me that that's a need. It's not something I'd really thought about before.
Right, essentially, acquisition and new development is what I see that. If
Best
that
use
fund is
of
gonna be,
leveraging,
use a
yeah.
fund put in place.
Okay.
You know, there are those other funds that we're able to tap for rehabilitation, as long as it's, low income and below, like, community development block grant funds.
Thank you, and I'll ask my last one is just a theoretical question. We'll talk about it another time. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Committee Member Rouse, or Mayor Rouse, however you want to be addressed today.
Yeah, just, your eminence would be just fine. So just a risk request on the funding program slides, if when we come to full council with this, if that could somehow be legible, that'd be cool. If this is coming to full council at some point, or is it, we don't know, okay. That's fine, because my question pertains to this. Since the RDA dissolved, and I saw I could barely make out the word California in a couple of these in the matrix. Other than the tax credit financing part, what other participations does the state have? And what I'm getting at was the dispensation of the surplus that went out over, and did that somehow help any of the 75 housing authority agencies across the state?
It has not.
Okay.
They haven't come directly to the housing authorities. What I would have liked to have seen from the state is looking at the funding that those local redevelopment agencies had before they were dissolved to put towards housing, and to put that amount back to the local jurisdictions that had the redevelopment agency to put towards affordable housing.
And did we make any entreaties with the state about that when that's was all coming down? And I talked to Senator Lamone about it, but that didn't get very far. So.
Right, I've made a few calls as well, and the California Association of Housing Authorities also pushed for some of those funds, but to
All right, very good. And my last question is, in terms of the inventory that you have today, which is obviously very impressive, and I appreciate your neighborhood compatibility stance on this, but are there potential units to be developed on existing projects that we have today? Is there any way to expand the number of units, or is that kind of a done deal, or what is your thought on that?
Well, we've already looked at the maximum we could get on 200 North La Cumbre and 400 West Carrillo, as far as what's the maximum we can put here and really have it acceptable to the neighborhood, with us being good neighbors. We always want to be good neighbors. So we do push and look at what can we put here. You know, I would love to have put 100 or more units on the Carrillo Castillo commuter lot, but it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit with not only the character of that gateway area coming into the city, but also neighboring to the neighbors to the north.
No, I do appreciate that. I would just kind of wonder if that was part of the consideration as we look forward to trying to satisfy arena numbers and affordability, so.
We do look at that. That's one of the reasons why we are looking at our own properties, our own developments, like Presidio Springs that's up on the screen right now. That's the one that we could probably get 200 or more units there and still have it fit within the neighborhood. We've done some initial designs on it, and we feel we can do that and have it be acceptable to the neighborhood and provide that many more senior units to the city that's needed, affordable senior units.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I have just a couple questions since most of them were answered. Just going with the density, I just appreciated that because when we're looking at the city, we have the AUD, the high density overlay of 63, and I noticed some of them were under that. But I think you answered that question, is it's neighborhood compatibility, but you are looking to increase density on some of your properties as well as when future projects come in, looking at a higher density. So just appreciate that.
Yes.
So the question, I'm gonna go back to the leveraging, and I appreciate that, that line of questioning, because I had the same thoughts. So a big portion of when we say we're leveraging $1, we'll get 10.2, is the low-income housing tax credit. So because it's a competitive application, it's not if the city gives you $100,000, you're gonna turn it into $1 million. It has to be strategic and enough. Let me phrase this in a question. Does it have to be enough to make that project competitive? For example, if we just gave you $100,000, it might not be competitive, but it would require $1 million. Is that how you look at it? It's not just for every dollar you get that 10.
Right, and that is why we'll come in with a request letter to Mr. Isaacson on, we've already done a pro forma, here is what's needed from the city if we are going to be competitive with the tax credits. So we look at that in our own really early pre-development process of what's needed to be competitive from the city.
Great. So that's helpful because I know there's, from the council, we want to help get you there. And sometimes it's like, why don't we, as part of our budget, allocate, one-off funds? But I think I just learned that you come to us with a request that you fully vetted out with a pro forma and you'll have that specific number. Whereas if we just came to a number, it might not be enough to get you over the line. And so that's helpful to understand for the future. For all of our colleagues on the council, I think should understand that. And then, so when the city, that's two more questions. When the city donates land, is that considered part of your pro forma in terms of the local match for a low-income housing tax credit program?
Absolutely.
Okay, so that counts towards it. And then getting to that, because the Carrillo commuter lot, is that eligible for the low-income housing, or is it because we're going into the 120 and above?
It's because we're going into the moderate and a little bit of middle income to make the numbers work for our equity investor, that it's not eligible for the low-income housing tax credit program. But what is great is we're able to take that whole cost of land out of the equation and for development from the investor, so that they have to put in less money to make all the numbers work. And the way we have it figured now is that it will work. It's a slim margin for the return that the investor needs, but that's something we're very excited about to get built, to show the community, to show the council this worked. And because of that donation of land is scarce as well. It's like, where are we going to come up with an appropriate sized land piece of property that's laid out in a way that we can build enough units to make something work? That's something we're always struggling with.
That's helpful because that 120 to 160 is very difficult to get built. So in terms of those projects, it might strategically as we consider from the city, that might be where we make a larger investment, whether it's land or a financial contribution or both. So the return on investment might not hit as high as with a low-income housing tax credit, but then but it becomes such a significant portion that we could get that type of housing built. So it might be a lower return on investment because I know you're leveraging other things, but it would be critical to have that. So we have to look at each project and with the city contribution and what it is to make it work.
Right. Yep. And before we leave the Carrillo Castillo commuter lot, I did want to say, which I think we've mentioned before, is that if everything blew up with the moderate middle income being able to build that, it's designed to where we can go in for low income housing tax credits and just provide housing for our low-income workforce there. And that would work. That would then be eligible for that. But the city, at the time, they wanted to see moderate income housing being built, and it's very much needed. So we're excited about that type of development and making it work.
Definitely an exciting project, and I'm glad we're able to understand it more today of how that partnership works and the partnership we have with you. So I don't have any additional questions, so at this time I will open up to public comment, and I want to check if the technical difficulties have been fixed before.
Yes, Chair Friedman, the technical difficulties have been fixed, but I also wanted to answer Councilmember Harmon's question about the amount of funding that the city allocates to affordable housing projects. I checked our budget, and in fiscal year 23 in the Community Development Department, we've appropriated $2.1 million for affordable housing projects.
Great work. That's quick to get the answer. Okay, so now I'm going to open it up to public comment. I will start here in the room. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? Please step forward. And not seeing any here, I will ask, is there any member of the public at home who wishes to speak? Are there any hands raised in the app? Please do so now.
There are no hands raised, Chair Friedman.
I will close public comment and now open it up for closing comments. And I'll start with Member Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Well, I think I can be very brief because I already said my thanks, and I really just mean it. I really, really very much appreciate all that you do for our community, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come here and share with us a little bit more in detail about how you do what you do. I think it's really imperative as we move through this series of conversations, thinking about how we can be most strategic in use of our funds. It's really just critical for us to have a clear understanding of how this work is done. And we get asked about it a lot, and I know we talk about it a lot, but I think we don't actually necessarily have a real clear understanding. So for me, this was really helpful, and I particularly appreciated the openness with which you talked about how your money was spent. I know for me that's something that's really important as we move through the conversations that I think are going to come. And again, I had to highlight just one more time how amazing it is, how little money gets spent on overhead. And I just want to make sure that everyone knows that, and that's really seared into our consciousness, because I think that's rare and it's a real gift for the community. So I appreciate that. I'm going to hang on to this because I know I'll be referring to it as we move through these conversations, and truly thank you, and our community thanks you.
Mayor Rouse, comments? And so I will close it up again. I just want to echo Member Harmon's comments and just appreciate everyone being here today. It's always great to see friends and learn about what you do in a more in-depth way and be able to present that to the public as well. It is an outstanding partnership. We wouldn't have some of our critical workforce living here if it wasn't for the Housing Authority with the hundreds and hundreds of units that you have. And then the Section 8 program that you're able to leverage even to more units within in the sector, so which comes out to well above the 10% of rental units, and to have that option as well. And just understanding for us in terms of long-term working with you, what it takes to get a project built and the city contribution, I think it's a good place to start those discussions on what it will take to get some type of funding source you can count on. And I agree with the mayor that we really need to come together as a community and other cities and jurisdictions to have those discussions with our state. And on, when I looked at the slide where you showed from 1999 to 2009 and 500 plus units were built, affordable units were built with RDA funds, and you look at that, and since that time it's been much more difficult to do. If we would have had that over the past 15 or so years, we would have had hundreds of more units available now. So that discussion is, there's local that we can do, but we also really need to engage the state on that, because then it looks at things regionally. And just really, again, appreciate all the work that you and your staff do, and with the resources that you have to provide housing and other services. I think that's the thing we haven't talked about so much. You mentioned it, is all those other services that allow the sustainability of your residents. And last night I was able to join you for the Family Self-Sufficiency Awards, and almost all of you were there, and it's just it shows that you take the housing, but then you take the next step, that the economic self-sufficiency of your residents when they have that housing stability. then they can take the time to get their education, to get, you know, their contractor's license, whatever it is that they want to do, and then they're able to really have the lifestyle that they want and contribute to the community. So it's Housing Plus is that you do. So again, we have to get to council, so thank you for your time today. Appreciate it. And this meeting is adjourned.